Well, good morning. This morning we continue in our series, The Human. And if you've been tracking with us through the series, we began it with this idea of epistemology, which is a big word that means how we know what we know kind of a stuff. And we talked about how we know things based on, yes, our experience, but also other people's testimony, whether those are friends or family members or neighbors or experts or scientists or whomever. We gather testimony so that we can sort of know stuff. And when it comes to what it means to be a human being or to be humanity, we're looking to consider the testimony of the witnesses of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has been revealed in creation throughout history and in Jesus Christ. That testimony recorded in this book we call the Bible. And so we've been looking at a Christian vision of what it means to be human or to be humanity. And we talked a little bit about how humanity is created. God created. So there is an intention and there is a purpose to us. And we were created in the image and likeness of God. We discussed how as humanity and as human beings, we are iconic of who God is and what God is like. And we talked a little bit more about how that icon of God is embodied in our maleness and in our femaleness. And we discussed how in that body, as we live, we actually represent God's presence here in His creation. This morning, what we want to discuss a little bit is about how that presence of God in creation and how we as human beings are an extension of God's rule and reign in His earth. Okay? Now, the Hebrew words for image and likeness are tselem and demut. And these two Hebrew words are interesting because there's an archaeological dig. That's always fun, isn't it? Getting a little dirty, finding some cool stuff in the dirt. And what was unearthed, I think it was in northern Syria, was this big stone pillar. And on top of it was an image of the king, was a sort of a carving, a stone sort of chisel of the king of the time. And in a language very similar to Hebrew, it's called Ugaritic, I think it was Ugaritic, tselem and demut, the image and likeness of the king. And what this big stone pillar represented was that the rule and the reign of whatever sort of Ugaritic speaking king that was extended to that place. So if you were to walk up and encounter this big stone pillar, you'd be like, oh, hold on. This image and likeness of this king means that this king rules here. Rules here. And so there's something about us as human beings that when people encounter us, not only should, or hopefully would, they encounter something of God's presence, but they would also encounter something of God's rule and reign. Now, we get a little bit twitchy about this. We get a little bit twitchy about human beings having sort of dominion over the earth because there are exploitative and ungodly ways in which humans have conducted themselves in that position of rule and reign. We've exploited nature, we've abused nature, we've misused nature, we've been selfish with nature. There's all kinds of different ways that we can point to where we've gone, humans have got it wrong in the way that they've exercised their dominion over God's creation. And that's important to notice, and that's important to name. Now, one of the problems is that we could probably sit and name all of those ways until we're blue in the face. We could sit and name those ways until we're blue in the face, and probably someone will be able to raise their hand and say, well, what about? And go, okay, yeah, I'll add that to the list too. Cool. But I want to think about how do we exhibit and express God, an extension of God's rule and reign in creation in a way that is theologically motivated. I think sometimes it can be a little bit tricky because a lot of our sociopolitics get involved and we go, oh, well, it was Earth Day, and oh, what about this, and oh, what about that, and oh, what about the other thing? And actually, politics is really fleeting, isn't it? What's politically in vogue one decade is not the next decade. And I would like for us as Christians to have a more enduring, robust, and resilient sort of attitude towards the creation and towards our role as human beings in creation. Because if we are understanding things and we're motivated by a love of God and an obedience to His Word, then actually there's probably going to be a resilience and a durability in our attitude towards how we express God's rule and reign over creation. Now, before we go much further, another just couple of things. When we go and we as humans have rule and reign over creation, it's important to notice that it is not an independent rule and reign. We are simply stewarding something that belongs to God. Many of you might already have in your heads Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So the first thing we want to think about when we're thinking about human beings having rule and dominion over creation and over the earth is that the earth is not ours. It's God's. The earth isn't ours to do with as we see fit or however we might like. Creation belongs to God. And in that Job reading that we had before from Job 38, God kind of sarcastically asks all these questions of Job. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? When I said this far is how far the ocean can go and no farther. As a matter of fact, that reading from Job, it carries on. And God kind of lays it on pretty thick. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked the recesses of the deep? What is the way to the abode of light, and where does darkness reside? Have you entered the snow houses of the snow or seen the storehouses of hail? Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you loose Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of waters? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? Do you hunt the prey for the lioness? And it goes on and on and on. And here's the thing, when it comes to creation, when it comes to this world, we know a lot, right? And actually, as much as we know so very, very little. We know, it's said that this is probably apocryphal, like probably not a real thing, but like there's this quote going around, like we know more about the universe than we know about our own oceans, kind of thing. Like there's just so much. I don't care how many David Attenborough, like what are they called? Documentaries, thank you. You've seen, but we know so little. I don't know how many Brian Cox things you've watched or read, but we know so little in all actuality. See, the earth belongs to God. God is the one who created it. God understands it. God knows all of these different things. And so when we look to be people who steward God's good creation, one of the things that we must do is consider what God has told us about it. And that doesn't mean that we don't engage in scientific inquiry. That doesn't mean that we don't engage with the natural sciences and we don't ask scrutinizing questions and we aren't curious and we don't wonder. And like Einstein said, we don't seek to think God's thoughts after him and understand what it is God has created and how we can come alongside that. But that's just the point. It's understanding what God has created and coming alongside His intention for it. It's understanding what God has created and coming alongside His intention for it. And one of His intentions in the creation is to reveal Himself in it. We can turn to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Let's start in verse 19. what may be known. We'll start in verse 18. It's uncomfortable. I'm not one to shy away from discomfort. Okay, you know what? We're gonna go from verse 18, and you guys will be like, oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Let it make you and sit in the discomfort and ask yourself, why am I so uncomfortable with this? Investigate that. Pray about it. Anyway, verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. One of the principal purposes of creation is to reveal to you and to me who God is and what God is like. In creation, sitting underneath the stars of a cloudless night sky, sitting in the redlands, laying back on the cushy, spongy ground with the giant evergreen trees shooting up in the air and blowing in the breeze, watching the lambs frolic about in lambing season, seeing the apple blossoms and the pear blossoms bloom, seeing children going about their way, walking to school and coming back from school. All of these things in creation, whether they're huge or small, reveal to us that there is an eternal power with a divine nature that exists. And we call that eternal power, and who has that divine nature, God. And that eternal power isn't a what, it is a who. And that who has a name. He's revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's got lots of names, actually. El Shaddai, El Roy, Jehovah Jireh. And gave a special name to Moses at the burning bush, Yahweh. I am what I am. I just am. And the I am stepped into creation. Didn't just say, hey guys, look what I made. You can tell that I'm here. But then stepped into his creation as a human being, Jesus of Nazareth, saying, this is who I am. And so as Christians, one of our views of what it means to be a human being is to steward this revelation of who God is and what God is like. To allow creation to point us to God, to point us to the eternal power, the divine nature that isn't a what, but who is a who, and who is who he is, who will be what he will be and who he will be, and has revealed himself to us. And so we care about creation. We care about plastic. We care about air quality. We care about water quality. We care about deforestation. We care about the flourishing of microbiomes, and like insects and all the small things that happen. We care about the use of pesticides, and we care about stuff because all of that stuff reveals God. And if you came up to me and took my Bible and spat on its pages and started ripping it up and using it for kindling for your barbecue or something like that, I'd say, hey, hold on, this book reveals God to us. Stop tearing out the pages and using it to light your barbecue. And you could say, well, but paper was given to me for my own purposes, and I want to have a barbecue, and so I'm going to rip out these pages and use it to light my barbecue. And I would say, no, because these pages aren't just pages. They reveal God to us. So please, let's have a similar attitude towards the creation. Not because it's Earth Day, and not because the world's going to fall apart by 2040, not because we're afraid, not because we're manipulated, not because everyone else is doing it, but because we've read the Word of God and we understand that all of this is His, and it reveals Him to us. And so we love it, we protect it, we promote it, and we want people to encounter God in it. We won't allow our convictions, our beliefs, our deeply held truths to be co-opted to en vogue politics. We're more than that as Christians. We are the kingdom of Christ. And so here at St. John's, we have Wild Church, rewilding Christian worship, saying, actually, yes, as much as this building and its stained glass might communicate something of God, you know what else does? The trees and the hills and the paths and the acorns and the dirt and the mud and the bird song. And so we're going to get out in creation and worship God there. And so we as humans have this thing where we've been given the stewardship of God's good earth. And perhaps you've seen the politicization of creation care and you've said, I want nothing to do with it because that's all just a bunch of progressive left-wing mumbo-jumbo. Or maybe you're sitting here and you said, you know what? I don't want anything to do with all that stuff because Christian history is full of exploitative practices, imperialism and all the rest of it, just exploiting the earth. And so I'm gonna hug my mother and care for planet Earth because I'm just gonna hug and love my mother that way. You know what? Actually, let's just do what God wants us to do. Let's care for His creation because it's His. Let's care for creation because it reveals God to us. Let's care for God's creation because it doesn't belong to us. And so when we go to care about God's creation, let's care about it God's way. And you might go, well, I don't know how to care about it God's way. I'm not sure. Hey, we've got some good tips. Let's investigate the scriptures and say, how am I meant to? And you know all those weird laws in the Old Testament? There's stuff about giving land rest in years of Jubilee. So here's an idea. Let's let land rest. What does that mean for your back garden? Does it mean maybe you say, you know what, I'm going to have a year when I don't mow. I'm just going to let it go crazy. Perish the thought. But what if you let your back garden rest? You didn't mow, you didn't spray it with anything, you just kind of let whatever happens happen. That might be a cool thing to do. That might be a cool thing to do. Maybe it's joining Wild Church from time to time as we kind of get back going and that sort of thing. It's like, I want to get out and actually engage with creation the way God intended it, to find Him in it and to worship Him in it. To not worship a tree, but to see a tree and worship its creator. And maybe we just need to step back and go, I just haven't thought about it. And I haven't thought about it because I think it's so fraught with like politics and junk that I've just sort of ignored it. And you just need to go, I'm going to engage. I'm going to care about creation because God created me too. And I want to step into the fullness of my humanity in that way. Just some things to think about. Let's take some time in sung worship, and let's also just take a moment to let God speak to us, whatever it is that He might have to say to you by His Spirit through what we've been talking about. Could be something completely different. But let's just have that time of sung worship to allow God to speak to us a little bit now.